Do we have a date, Jason, on when spring practice starts?
I've not seen a date yet, Mark. I would anticipate that probably coming out here in the middle, in the middle of this month at least. I think it's interesting. You know, Venables in terms of his strategy with players, and I think so I think in strategy with players in terms of media availability and stuff like that when we start talking to some of these kids is the whole spaces situation with Twitter is gaining tons and tons of steam, and there's been some spaces where some of the Oklahoma players have been um, part of that, but Venables has immediately shut that down, and no availability right now. So haven't really heard anything either from a player perspective or from a coaching perspective on when spring practice will begin. But I like I said, I would anticipate it getting something either by the middle towards the end of this month, because it'll get started in March at some point, and then you probably would assume your spring game is kind of early April, maybe closer, maybe mid-April, but somewhere in that time frame.
So, folks, we are just about 5 or 6 weeks away from spring practice. So we'll be previewing positions and getting you set for spring practice, and of course, gathering all the information and the spring practice notes as they become available, and we know what's going on there in camp as we get to spring practice. So that becomes an exciting time of year. And so, Jason, just going into spring practice, do you have a thought about what intrigues you the most? What do you have the most questions about? What you think needs sorted out the most on either side of the ball?
Everything.
Yeah.
I think Mark, I think it's very. I've kind of remarked to a couple of people that I know that we kind of share, some information and talk about Oklahoma football, and I think it's interesting because I think this will be probably the most anticipated spring game that Oklahoma has had in quite some time. Because when you look at it, it's a complete turnover, right? When you look completely new, completely new offensive scheme, completely new defensive scheme. Everything's new on the defensive side of the ball, from a coaching perspective, right? Based on what they've had in the past. You're breaking in a new quarterback. You've got a lot of new players. We talked about the number of people that have left, number of new people. You're in the 30s, you're in the mid 30s of new roster kids. So I think there's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of stuff that you don't really get a good feel and a good opportunity to see in a spring game because of the how they protect the kids and stuff like that, which is needed. So obviously, I think first and foremost, the biggest interest really overall is seeing the quarterback. The quarterback play is obviously the biggest interest. I think for me, what is interesting is just looking to see from a body type perspective. One of the things we've talked about a lot for Oklahoma is they've not been as big specifically on the offensive defensive lines as they've needed to, and there's already been horror stories about Jerry Schmidt from some of these kids that have and they haven't even gotten to any of the hard stuff yet. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what does the evolution of some of these kids' bodies look like. Obviously, it's not a lot of time, and there'll be more time in through the summer and stuff like that to what they look like in fall. So I think that's really interesting. What they look like up front, like I said, the three biggest areas of concern that I've had from this team last year, and then coming up, and just to see how much they can improve the offensive line, the defensive line, and then the secondary. I think Oklahoma's done a really good job, all three areas, making improvements to the roster. They've added transfer portal kids. They've added kids um, you know, through the recruiting cycle as well at those, and I think they like their numbers there. Just will be interesting to see what that looks like out on the field. So I'm really looking forward to this period here between what we have now on signing day and then when spring practice, just to start looking at some of that and breaking some of that down, even from position by position, just to see what that looks like. Linebacker position is really something that's very intriguing to me as well. Oklahoma wasn't necessarily horrible at the linebacker position last year, but they've lost Nick Benito, they've lost um, the other line, Brian Asamoah, and so they've added those. They've added a lot of young kids there into the mix. So it'll be interesting to see what that lineup looks like, and what kids are emerging as kids that can really challenge for starting spots and going to add depth, and what that looks like.
Yeah, Ron Brown here, I assume is an Oklahoma fan because he refers to the way he refers to the team. But boy, he's looking at a dire recruiting forecast here. This class is what you're going to see going forward. Recruiting battles with Kansas State, Iowa State, Tulsa, Texas Tech will not work. I'm not seeing that.
No, I don't either. Mark, I think what Oklahoma will be. They'll recruit. I mean, think about when you think about this on how everything happened, and Oklahoma slid. They were a probably top 5, 6, 7 recruiting class, and they slid all the way to 19th. And to be able to rally that to the 7th, yeah. I mean, to Ron's point, there's a couple of kids that they flipped from Iowa State. They're looking to try to flip from Iowa State. There's a couple of other kids that they're in battles with teams that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But I absolutely don't think that's going to be um, a thing of the future. Oklahoma has so many dynamic recruiters on this staff. When you talk about Brent Venables himself, when you talk about Cale Gundy, Jeff Lebby doesn't really get a ton of notoriety from a recruiting perspective, but in the short time that he's been here, he's got 3 quarterbacks that has been able to come that he's got commitments from. Obviously, Jackson Arnold is the 2023 kid, but with Dylan Gabriel and then Nick Evers here in this 2022 cycle, he's done a phenomenal job. Talked about Cale Gundy, DeMarco Murray's has turned into a really great recruiter. And then you talk about all the guys on the defensive staff. We talk about Jay Valai. You talk about even Miguel Chavis, who's a new guy, but he's done a good job. So I think Oklahoma is probably in a better position recruiting than they've been in quite some time. Obviously, Oklahoma was much, much better under Lincoln Riley, and there was a renewed emphasis on just what it takes to recruit at a high level, and they've done that. And I wouldn't think anything other than that same trajectory will still move forward. I'll say, but it can even be better. But I will say the thing that's going to continue to haunt Oklahoma is playoff success. They've got to be in a position where they've at least won a playoff game, if not a national championship. That will just, they've recruited so well without that. And obviously, we know there's only a few teams that are winning playoff games and winning national championships and stuff like that, right? So, but I think Oklahoma needs to be in that position, and they may be in this position next year, Mark. I think early on we thought, yeah, this might be a little bit of a rebuilding year, maybe a 8-4, 9-3 season. But I think Oklahoma has the team in place and has the depth in place at these key positions. If it materializes, I think the way that some of us think that it might, that they have every opportunity to challenge for a Big 12 championship this next year. And then, obviously, if you win a Big 12 championship, you're in the driver's seat to, depending on how the season goes, obviously, but you're in the driver's seat to be able to make one of those playoff games. So I think that would be just a huge success story for Oklahoma if they come back and they're able to win a Big 12 championship, which you have to think that Oklahoma's, right there, Oklahoma, Baylor, Texas. to a certain degree, those are the three probably favorites coming in. And I know that we'll talk about this a ton, but I think that's the next part. You know, that they will recruit well based on what some of these defensive coaches have done, their um, their history of success at other programs that they've been, and feel like that they're able to sell that to some of these kids. So I see that continuing and even getting better.